again in our series of Learning from Others. We've had talks with people from Canada, Australia, and all around the globe. And I'm here with my friend, Mike Donnelly, who I've known not as long as I ought to have known, but we've both been in parallel universes, I think, doing the same. I've got like 25 years of experience campaigning for home education and freedom of education. And you, Mike? How long have you been at this?
Well, I've been homeschooling. My wife and I have been homeschooling our seven children since, well, you could say since they were born, starting in 1997. We have seven children aged 13 to 27. And I got fully engaged in advocating for home education freedom in 2006 when I joined HSLDA as a senior counsel and director for global outreach. But prior to that, I'd been engaged in state level politics in the state of New Hampshire. And even before that, was engaged in other political advocacy work. So I've been doing political advocacy work for 20 to 25 years.
And so for a bit of context for the people here in the UK, states have their own legislation. So it's a little bit like me dealing with England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland separately.
Yeah, very much so. Exactly. Right. So I was in the state of New Hampshire where there's about 1.2 million people. We have a legislature. In fact, it's like the third or fourth largest legislature in the democratic world with 400 representatives. That's one representative for every 2,500 people. So you get to know people pretty well, and you can have a lot of influence on your legislator when you've got that kind of representation. Most states don't have anything like that. I mean, in the US Congress, you've got one representative for 700,000 people. So that kind of proportionality makes a difference when you're trying to influence policymakers. Anyway, that's where I got started.
That's great. So, I mean, one of the things that we were chatting about earlier is that when you've been at it as long as you and I have, you do kind of hone your techniques. And the other thing is you see the same issues coming up again and again and again. You're like, oh, here we go again. We've got that with this legislation that we're expecting here called the Children and Wellbeing Bill, which we think is going to be even worse than the attempt with the schools bill. All the same issues coming up again and again. And those issues are actually global. There seems to be quite a fear of somebody, where the buck stops, being there in office when a child dies or something like that. And there seems to be a kind of like massive overreaction from thinking about one child being damaged and not a thought about how one of my favorite words is iatrogenic. So iatrogenesis is when by trying to do good, you're actually doing harm at the same time. So the iatrogenic effect of big state is that, we have too much control, not enough freedom, children feeling watched, families feeling watched the whole time and being controlled and not able to relax and develop into the great citizens that you would hope a government would want to have. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, there's a truth. Governments want to control people. Bureaucrats want to be in charge, and the legislators, our elected representatives, are not able to control them anymore. This is a global phenomenon. We have it in the United States at the federal level, even at the state level. In the US, we'll call it the deep state. These are the bureaucrats who are unelected, virtually unaccountable, and they run the executive branches of government. And you see it in departments of children and families at the state level. To your point, so you reference this idea of children being maltreated or dying. And, to me, I reject the whole idea that has anything to do with education. In the sense of schooling, we can look at statistics on where these things happen. And I would point people to look at some research done by Danny Shaquille, who's actually a professor over in England, with Brian Ray. They did a study on the correlation and connection between home education and abuse and neglect. In the United States, we had a blue ribbon federal panel maybe 10 or 15 years ago that looked at the issue of child abuse fatalities in education. And what they found is there's no relationship between child abuse, fatality, and education. Yes, there are parents out there who are not good parents. Yes, the authorities need to be involved, but that doesn't mean you put regulations on homeschooling. Like, and that whole idea feeds into a stereotype and also supports the premise that I mentioned before, which is that governments want to control things. You hear it in states in the United States like Massachusetts, and I've heard it in the UK from my friends in the UK who talk about what the government is saying about homeschooling. And they say, oh, well, the children aren't visible to the community, which is a complete is ridiculous. Okay, because homeschooled children are highly visible in communities, and and the reality is that homeschooling parents, the vast majority, I'd say 99 point, maybe 7.5, maybe 8.5, maybe it's 99.9%, are doing a great job, and there's maybe 0.1, 0.01% of situations that may need some attention, and they end up getting attention because you can't hide abuse for that long. People find out because people observe things, and generally when people see something serious, they will report it to the authorities.
And we come back to that concept that protecting children is everybody's job in that respect, in that if you see something happen, you are duty bound to report it. You can't go and drive past that community that abuse is happening at and not report it, or that house that something's happening and not report it. And generally speaking, people do report things, and then it's up to the state to act. And I know from some research I've looked into, and from some serious case reviews I've looked into, that in every single case where harm came to a home educated child, they were already known to at least 10 different authorities. Already known. They were already red
flags. It's the
flagged.
same in the US. It's exactly the same. This is what we see time and time again. And then, but what happens? And this is just happening in my home state of West Virginia. Recently, there was a child who was in a very malnourished state, and the facts are a little bit unclear, right? Like, it wasn't exactly clear what happened, but what was clear is that the authorities had been there, they had been engaged with the family, and before even a week or two goes by, suddenly you've got the state Senate president and the governor of the state all saying, oh, this child was homeschooled. We've got to have more controls on homeschooling. We don't have enough regulations on homeschooling. We've got to do something about this before they even know the facts.
Absolutely. And the other thing you get connected with this, and we see this in the House of Commons the whole time, is I can't believe we don't have a register of home educated children. It's common sense, and common sense is not an argument for making legislation. And it isn't common sense when you start digging down into it. So we have to, one of my pushbacks in the last couple of years has been, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence. Make your policies evidence-based. Don't just think them up or imagine them. And we've had a few members of Parliament whose names I will not name, but who I've looked into their backgrounds, and they've maybe been teachers who have witnessed some horrific things or have had really bad childhoods themselves, and they're feeding their personal bias into the politics instead of looking at the evidence. And it's really tricky to deal with those damaged people when you're looking at policy making.
Well, we all bring our perspectives to the table.
We do.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We do. So I don't know. I think one of the lessons I've learned over the years has been to just not react straight away, to step back and to have a look at the context of what's coming. One of the things that happens over here, which really irritates me, is people will write a petition like that, and they won't think about it. And you only get so many tries at a petition, because if you put a petition into Parliament and then somebody puts a better worded one in that's about the same subject, they'll reject the second one because somebody's already had a go. So people will, fire away on their keyboards and go and do something, or they will write a letter, or they will try and have a street protest about something without thinking pragmatically and without thinking about what the effect of that is going to be. So one of my lessons has been in the last 20 years that step back, do your research, have a think about it, Try and gather as many allies as you can from outside of the community you're dealing with as well, and try and come together and find some common ground that will appeal to the general public. Because if you are fighting for a minority, the general public won't understand what you're fighting about. There's a massive education thing and there's a massive PR thing, and there's trying to get allies on board. So, for example, we've got the problem in Wales I was talking to you about earlier, where the medical profession are being asked to divulge details on the basis of nothing whatsoever, just on a general basis of all their patients who are under 18 or under 16 to local government, which is a massive breach of privacy. And then they're using those lists to sift out the unknown home educators and the children missing education. Now, this is about children missing education and home educated children. It's not actually about the general population, but we can appeal to the general population because their data is also being shared. So that's an example where you need to go really outside of the population that you're looking at in order to gather the big, lots of people. You said something earlier to me as well, that what you have to remember is politicians always want to be re-elected.
Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, ultimately, that's what politicians want, in a democratic state, is they want to be reelected almost most of the time. And so what that means is you've got to mobilize the constituents that matter to them. But I thought you said some really important things, Alison, that are worth reinforcing. Number one, coalition building is extremely important. You made a great point about home educators, and this is especially true in the UK and in Europe. You're in the minority. That's true in the United States as well, but we are such a large minority. We can punch above our weight, so to speak.
Yeah.
And because we are very organized in the United States, we are able to create campaigns that are very powerful and communicate very powerfully to the politicians in power. And so, when a politician gets one email, they can ignore it. When they get 100 emails, they can't ignore it. And they start to get very nervous because they think, oh my goodness, if I'm getting 100 emails, that means this is a big issue and I better address it. So being organized is important. And what you said about having a think and not just reacting, also very important. It's important for home educators, if possible, to work together with organizations. And there's lots of organizations. I know in the UK, you've got a lot of different organizations, but working together is critical. We're just not large enough to afford to be able to act independently. And that means we sometimes have to work with people we may disagree with on certain things. I've been to over 30 countries, traveled almost 1 million miles around the world advocating for homeschool freedom. There's a lot of Christians who homeschool. There's a lot of non-Christians who homeschool. And I found sometimes that kind of religious perspective can separate people. And that's fine. I mean, look, we can disagree about things, but what I found unifies homeschooling parents of all beliefs, okay, Muslim, atheist, Christian, name all the rest you want to, is they believe that parents are best suited to decide what's best for their children, whether it's health, but in this case, about education. And that's something that I think we can come together on. When we started the Global Home Education Exchange 15 plus years ago now, what we unified on was this concept that home education is a human right, no matter how or why people want to do it. You want to be an autonomous learner or, whatever you want to call it, unschooling, we call it in the United States, or if you want to be more structured and have a curriculum, Christian curriculum or a Muslim curriculum or what have you, that is the right of the parent to decide. And when government gets involved dictating to parents what children should learn, you've crossed into the line of authoritarianism and you're on your way towards totalitarianism. And we cannot allow that. And so when you frame it in the perspective of freedom, because that's what it's about government staying in its box and not encroaching on everyone's freedom. And so if we can frame it as a freedom issue, which is what it is, then I think we can enlist the general public. And as you pointed out, if you can find issues with a particular policy that connect with other people and other organizations, you're going to be much more successful in creating a more powerful coalition and opposing, these attempts at encroaching on our freedom. That's what I've seen. I mean, and the other thing I've seen around, especially in our country, but around the world, is homeschooling Homeschoolers are pretty good at doing this. I've seen it in the UK time and time again. You guys have gotten your act together. Not that it isn't together, but you've come together and you've opposed the Badman report. And then in 2018 there was stuff, and then you got all this guidance coming out from your Ofsted. And you know, I think what y'all are doing there in the UK is fantastic. I will tell you that in the United States, what we've seen since 2003 is a virtually unbroken trend of, I'll use the word deregulation. You don't necessarily want to use that word. You want to be careful about the words you use depending on where you are, because some people don't like deregulation.
Yeah.
So you might say more respectful legislation. We've removed unnecessary or unreasonable burdens from parents, because in the US we had regulations that were more burdensome in the early days. And since then we've had over 23 states have changed their laws to remove unnecessary burdens. Look, in the UK, you guys have got the best law in the world.
In England.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I said UK. I meant England. Thank you for correcting me. Sorry. I do that sometimes,
I know.
You guys, you know what I mean. Anyway, in England, you have the best. Well, and that law does go to other parts of the UK in some respects, because it hasn't been completely devolved in certain situations. I know a little bit about UK law. Anyway, so you've got the best law in the English Education Act, 1996 Education Act, which respects the rights of parents. And here's the thing: if government wants to burden citizens, as you said before, data-driven, it should have a reason for doing it. Okay, it shouldn't just do it because, oh, it's common sense. Why? Why should you burden a citizen with a regulation unless you have a reason for doing it? Okay, they don't really have a reason. Oh, well, we have to know where everybody is so that we can make sure that kids who aren't in school are in school. Well, not really. You don't have to do that. You can trust parents, because ultimately that's what this really comes down to, is a question of whether government trusts its citizens or not. And when it's doing this kind of legislating to create a list, which when governments create lists, boom, alarm bells should go off. Okay, and we should always oppose that, generally speaking, because when government is making lists, it's for a reason, and it's not usually because they want us to be free. It's because they want to figure out a way to control us.
Yeah, I know that we've recently had some interesting movement in UNESCO, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
And I think we can talk a little bit in the round about that, really.
Sure.
So UNESCO are in the middle of a project to look at home education through a freedom lens, are they not? Yeah.
Sort of. They are looking at through the lens of human rights, a rights-based perspective. And I have to tell you, okay, you guys know I'm an American. I'm a conservative. I was in the U.S. Army. Okay, I'm a Reagan Republican. I'm all about freedom, right? And here in the U.S., people who believe like I do are not too keen on the United Nations, because generally what we've seen the United Nations do is more what we were talking about before: control. They want to help governments control people. They get involved in things they probably shouldn't. So this is my perspective. Okay. Anyway, so I'm generally negative on the UN. Okay. So I'm not. So anyway, but I've gotten involved with the UNESCO, and because I have expertise and they've sought me out and I've contributed. And I have to tell you, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with what they're doing. I think it's exciting, because to me, even though in the US we have this kind of jaded view or cynical view or negative view of the United Nations, that's not the case in most of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world has a very positive view, or at least they admit that the United Nations, it should be listened to in some respects, and it has a position of authority when it comes to human rights. Fine, that's fine. We just recognize that. And it's not necessarily bad for a lot of countries around the world that don't have a written constitution like we do. You guys don't have a written constitution, but you have a constitution. You have common law, and you have rights that are recognized. We wrote them down in our constitution, and we try to protect them that way. But there are a lot of countries where the human rights pronouncements of the United Nations are helpful, because it pushes back on what might otherwise happen in those countries where those rights would not be respected. So there's a place for the UN, and I'm just saying what my perspective. But what UNESCO is doing right now and looking at homeschooling, I think is very exciting, because if UNESCO and the United Nations realize and recognize home education as a legitimate form of education, which is, I believe, what's going to come out of this report, and that is going to be huge for so many countries around the world where homeschooling is not even a thing at all. Like in the UK and England, you guys are definitely recognized, and you're small. In the United States, it's huge, relatively speaking. But in so many countries, it's very tiny, and they fight for recognition. And they have to point to the United States, or they have to point to England, and a lot of legislators in those countries don't care, or they don't care like what's happening in the United States. They're like, oh, that's the United States. Of course, they're crazy.
Yeah.
They do things that way.
Yeah.
Or England. I mean, that's a developed country. We can't be like them in that respect. We have to run our education system this way. And so to have the United Nations come out and actually recognize home education under the various conventions as a legitimate exercise of human rights is going to be massively important for people. I also think that the experts that they have pulled together, there's a group of 20 to 40 experts that they're seeking input from, are really good, and they're balanced. Some of them are fairly state oriented, but a lot of them are not. And so it's definitely a diverse group and with diverse opinions. So I think it's great. I think it's exciting. I think there's going to be a report published probably in the next 6 months or so from UNESCO on home education. I think it's, from my perspective, it's probably going to be probably about as good as you could hope for.
Yeah, I was because I was privileged enough to read the document, as you know.
Oh, fantastic!
And
I
was quite impressed. Given that it was in draft form, I was pretty impressed with how far they'd come with it. And yeah, that was really, really good. I mean, I think my worry is that that we get dragged into the European model of home education, which seems to be leaning towards imposed curriculum and examination. And I think that it's not a good thing for the future of our young people. I mean, if I was to get on my soapbox for a minute, I work all the time in schools with children who have special educational needs. And I just see the curriculum and the school regime and even the school building not suiting those children at all. A big, huge minority, far bigger than the home educating minority, are being damaged by school because school is not right for them. But not only that, I look at the education, and so we have GCSEs at 16, which are a passport to getting the next level of education, which is then the passport to getting into university. And this year, they are removing the formula sheets again from GCSEs. Now, this might sound like a really tiny point, but this is, for me, indicative of how out of touch the government is with what education should look like. So if you were an engineer working in a factory somewhere, designing something for that factory, a new piece of equipment, a new building, whatever it was, would you be expected to remember every single formula that you'd ever learned in order to put them in place? No, you would not. You'd have a book that you'd look things up at. You would know how to go and find the things you needed in order to put your project together. That's the type of education we should be having. And actually, that's what home education does all the time, because children look at projects and they see things through the eyes of the activity of an interest. For example, they'll follow that interest. They'll learn all sorts of things about the wider world and all sorts of different subject areas. They're not just sitting learning X, Y, and Z by rote so that they can sit an exam. They have a proper education. And what goes on in school is quite often not what I would call a proper and adequate education. And it's not developing children who then become young people who are able to become self-motivated learners and are self-motivated in all aspects. It's producing sheep. who need to be told what to do. And it's really disappointing. And recently, the employers have come out in the UK and said that they don't think the education's fit for purpose either. So, you know, the whole thing's an absolute mess. So if they go and start trying to impose their broken school system on home education, which actually functions really well and is full of refugees from that broken school system, you know, I think we're in for a riot. Certainly not
Well,
in.
I think so. We've seen that in the U.S., of course, whenever somebody tries to impose a new regulation, the homeschoolers come out. I mean, I've been to dozens of state capitals over my time at HSLDA, where thousands of homeschooling parents would come down to the Capitol with signs and rally. And I mean, that's what you've got to do sometimes. And you know, and when that happens, that scares the legislators because they know that when people are that motivated, they get there to watch out for their votes, and that threatens their reelection campaign. So, you know, if you want to oppose a bad bill, you've got to get out and be active and organized and in a coalition, and you've got to get out and demonstrate, and you've got to write letters, and you've got to make phone calls. And you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, how do you make a difference to protect homeschooling freedom. There's a couple of basic things. One is be organized, work together. Two, you know, one of the things that the homeschool movement really needs to work at, and we've done this in the US and varying levels of efficacy, is putting a face to the movement. There's nothing better than a legislator meeting in the district with a nice homeschooling family as a representative, so that when that issue comes up, they can have a name and a face and a family, and they can think, you know, this is going to affect my constituents, this family who I know, and now I'm going to have to go and justify my vote to this family who I've had the opportunity to meet with. So I think that's really important. So organized, face to the movement, and to do that, you've got to have organizations that are helping to do that kind of thing, like the things that you are doing in the UK. But you said something really, I think, helpful, Alison. You know, about school. You know, in schools, schools are part of a top-down control system. You know, in the United States, we don't talk about this that much, not enough. But Horace Mann was the founder of the Common School movement in 1850 in Massachusetts, where they passed the first compulsory education law. And the purpose was not to educate children. The purpose was to control people coming in from Ireland and Italy who were Catholics, and they were afraid. Okay, the Protestants, and I'm kind of a Protestant believer, were afraid that these Irish Italian Catholics who had their loyalties to the Pope were somehow going to upset the apple cart in the United States. Okay, that's what motivated him. And he also had been in Germany and Prussia, actually, not Germany, because Germany wasn't even a thing back then, right? It was Prussia.
Prussia.
Okay, and so he was in Prussia, and the Prussians had started their own kind of uniform education system at this point, a kindergarten. Okay, and their purpose was to create soldiers, and it works really well for that, right? But that's not what education is or should be about. As you pointed out, education should be about helping people realize their full potential, which is what the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognizes on Article 26.1, what the purpose of education is. And I think that is a good purpose. I think we should embrace that purpose. And it's, you know, it's not just about creating soldiers for the state or, you know, factory workers for private industry. Okay. But that's what the system was created for, and was then later, after the 1850s, then into the 1920s in the United States. You know, the industrialists said, oh, we've got a system here that we can use, and we should apply our science of government. Okay. You had people, you know, who were imposing these standards and metrics on, you know, schools, which, you know, work in an assembly line when you're trying to create uniform outputs. Okay, that's great. But they applied that science to school, and they said, oh, let's ring bells so that the students can, you know, get used to hearing a bell ring when it's time to, you know, go to lunch in the factory. Like, these are the crazy things. And then we do these things and we don't understand where they came from or why, and we just keep doing them. And so so when you look at the school system that we created here in the United States, which has been exported to the rest of the world, okay, you know, our system, you know, because it came from Germany to us, and then it morphed or mutated, if you will. And then it became this system that everybody says, "Oh, well, let's do it like that." And of course, England has some culpability here, because
Oh yeah.
the East India, West India companies created
Mhm.
their own schools and these systems that there's been some interesting research on that also influenced how schools were created. But I will say this: I'll say this about England. You guys have John Locke, and his ideas on education, I think, are really fundamental. Fortunately, in the United States, a lot of those ideas came over at our founding, and he wrote that education belongs to the family, not to the state. And I think that's why you have your English Schools Act that recognizes that families don't have to answer to the state to make the decision to home educate, and that's the
Well,
way it should be.
we also have some influence from the public school system, what we call the public school system, which is not what you call the public school system. So the very posh private schools, okay, which were called public because anybody could go to them so long as they paid the fees. Yeah, so that made them public. Um, and those schools were you look at some of the research that's been done and some of the survivors of boarding school, and I do call them survivors because quite often boarding school is not a great place to go. Separating boys in particular from their families when they were 7-8 years old was a purposeful thing, because it hardened them up, took them away from the nurturing influence of their mothers, and it made them into good empirists. They were
Company men.
Yep. They would say yes, they would go where they were told to go, and they would be quite hard and unfeeling, etc. And we've got to remember that we've got that influence as well. So some of the practices within schools that we have within our state school system come from those horrible places where they were intentionally separating families. There's research that shows that mothers and fathers are really important for the lives of children quite a long way. And if we are separating children from their families and from the good influences of their family and from that secure attachment that they have, we are saving up massive problems for the future. And the government has just introduced here free childcare for 15 hours a week for 9-month-olds up. And that is going to double to 30 hours next September. And I think that's an experiment which is going to have massive consequences. We're going to have an entire generation that doesn't know how to parent because they've not had the opportunity to parent. So Mike, I just want to say thank you very much for joining me today. Hopefully people will learn some things from that conversation. I learned some things from that conversation, and yeah, that was really great. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Alison. I think, the thing you were saying at the end there about secure attachments was so important, and the work of Gordon Neufeld in that area. I would really recommend people to read Gordon Neufeld's books about attachment, and it's just critical. So thank you for what you're doing, and it's been a pleasure to be with you as well. If I can be of any service to you, the homeschool community in England or the UK or elsewhere, I'd be happy to. It's been a privilege for me to be part of this homeschool movement for so many years, and I'm excited to see how things develop in England. I'm confident that you all are equipped and capable to defend the movement, and I'm certain that you will be victorious.
Thank you so much. Thank you.